Most Americans assume you can only live in the present. You buy a house, the HOA tells you what colour to paint it, the city rezones the block, and in 10 years the neighbourhood looks completely different. That's the deal. Except, it isn't. Not everywhere. There are 7 towns still standing in this country where that deal was never made. Some of them have fewer than 1,000 people. One of them has 5. And one of them has been on fire underground since 1962. I know that sounds insane. It's not. These places are on the map, they're incorporated, and real people are living in them right now. Here's what the major real estate platforms won't tell you. Because platforms are built for transactions and these towns mostly don't transact the way normal markets do. Local historians, preservation officers, and the families who've lived in the same houses for 3 generations will tell you something different. That across the American interior, in Nevada, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Arkansas, Arizona, New Mexico, there are municipalities where the built environment froze, literally or by law, at a specific moment in history, and the rest of the country just moved on without them. This isn't a pattern you'll find on Zillow. It's a pattern you find in National Register of Historic Places designations, in oral history archives, in federal evacuation orders, and in the geological surveys of ground that is still burning. And it's not one place, it's 7. The entire city is a historic district, not a neighbourhood, not a corridor, the entire city. When the National Register of Historic Places listed Eureka Springs in 1970, the boundaries of the historic district encompassed the whole municipality, which means that if you live here and you want to change your facade, install a new porch railing, or update your storefront signage, you go through historic review first. That is not a technicality. That is daily life for roughly 2,100 people in the Ozark Hills of northwestern Arkansas. The town was founded in 1879 as a mineral springs resort. The premise was simple. The springs had healing properties, and people came from across the South and Midwest to take the waters. What they built on those steep Ozark hillsides was a Victorian resort infrastructure that was considered modern in 1885 and has not been fundamentally altered since. The narrow switchback roads that cling to the hillsides were cut to handle horse-drawn carriages and foot traffic, not cars, and they remain that width today. The gridded upper town and the curved lower town routing date to the late 19th century and are essentially unchanged. Gas-style streetlights line the sidewalks. Carved stone steps connect streets at different elevations. Iron railings, original wooden fences, and sidewalks in use for over a century are not decorative. They are the actual pedestrian infrastructure. The railroad depot, built in 1910, marks the height of the resort era. By then, Eureka Springs had reached a peak population of around 3,800 people, an established destination in the American interior, accessible by rail and drawing visitors who would stay for weeks. What happened after is what happened to most resort towns that depended on a single attraction. The cultural moment shifted, automobile travel changed how Americans moved, and the healing springs industry faded. The population never returned to its peak. Today it runs around 2,100, just over half of what it was at the height of the Victorian era. What makes Eureka Springs structurally different from a restored historic district is that the preservation was not cosmetic. The entire routing of the town, how streets connect, where they go, at what grade, is the original routing. You cannot straighten a road here. You cannot widen a street without triggering a review process. Families with roots in the 1880s to 1910s resort era still operate businesses in the same buildings their grandparents occupied. The town functions as an island in the Ozarks, accessed by those same steep switchback roads and a historic rail line with no through connection to the national rail network. The honest drawback is the isolation itself. Eureka Springs is a beautiful and fully functional small town, but it is not close to anything. The nearest city with significant hospital infrastructure is over an hour away by road. The local economy depends heavily on tourism, which means the town is crowded in summer and quiet to the point of economic fragility in winter. And the very restrictions that preserve the character of the place also constrain any property owner who wants to make structural improvements. For some people, that's a selling point. For others, it's an obstacle they didn't expect when they moved here. Ask anyone who's tried to replace their windows with energy-efficient models and had to get period-appropriate glass approved first. There is a town in eastern Kentucky that was, for a brief period in the 1920s and 1930s, the largest coal camp in the world. Not in Appalachia, not in the United States, in the world. US Coal and Coke, a subsidiary of US Steel, built Lynch from scratch starting in 1917 on a piece of ground in Harlan County that had been essentially wilderness. They built everything: the houses, the streets, the company store, the hospital, the school. They laid out the grid, poured the foundations, and moved 10,000 people in. 10,000 people. The current population is 652. That's a 93.5% decline. And if you drove through Lynch today without knowing that history, you would see something that looks like a town that had a very bad couple of decades, but otherwise stayed exactly where it was. Because it did. The company town grid is intact. Broad, straight streets laid out by engineers, not by organic growth, remain the street layout of Lynch. Block-like housing clusters with 1920s chimneys and porches, row house coal company homes, the original company store. These structures are still standing. The coal industry collapse came in the 1950s and 1960s. The mines shut down, the company pulled out, and the population that had been imported to work those seams left in reverse order, quickly and almost completely. But some families didn't leave. Oral history projects in Harlan County have documented families living in the same company house for 3 or more generations, grandparents who worked the seams, children who stayed when everyone else went, grandchildren who grew up in a town that peaked before their parents were born. Appalachian history essays describe Lynch as looking like it stepped out of a 1920s coal camp illustration. That comparison is accurate in a way that goes beyond aesthetics. The architecture is not a recreation. It is not a heritage district in the civic sense. Lynch is incorporated and recognised, though its historic preservation is noted in architectural studies rather than formal NRHP district listing. What it represents is a rare case of a fully designed company town, where the design survived the company's departure by 70 years and counting. The honest drawback is economic in the most direct sense. Harlan County has faced persistent poverty since the coal economy collapsed. Services that were provided by the company, the hospital, certain utilities, community infrastructure, had to be replaced or absorbed by a tax base that shrinks every decade. The 652 people who remain are not living in a museum. They are living in a real town, with real bills, a real school system under pressure, and real roads that need maintenance. The preserved architecture is not separated from those realities. It is the physical container for them. In the mid-1870s, Virginia City, Nevada, had 30,000 residents. To put that in context, San Francisco had around 200,000 at the same time. Virginia City was not a frontier outpost. It was a functioning city, with newspapers, opera, a stock exchange, and a population density that would have been recognizable in any eastern city of the era. All of that was because of one thing: the Comstock Lode, the richest silver deposit ever discovered in North America. The Comstock Lode was discovered in 1859. Within 15 years, Virginia City had been built out of the Nevada desert at an elevation above 6,000 feet, connected by railroad and telegraph to San Francisco and the world. The population hit its peak in the mid-1870s and then began to collapse almost immediately as the silver output declined. By the 1880s, the boom was functionally over. Today the population is 787, a 97% decline from its peak. What remains is documented by the National Park Service as an intact collection of over 400 buildings, most dating from the 19th century. The Fourth Ward School, built in 1876. Piper's Opera House from 1878. St Mary's Catholic Church from 1877. St Paul's Episcopal Church from 1875. Comstock-era mine offices and saloons along B Street. Main Street retains its narrow 1860s to 1880s grid with compressed building spacing. The footprint of a city designed for horses and foot traffic at a time when 30,000 people needed to move through it. Virginia City became a National Historic Landmark District in 1961, which means contributing structures cannot be razed. The 400-plus buildings above ground are legally protected. Beneath them, hundreds of abandoned mine shafts and adits remain, preserved as interpretive features, because sealing them all would cost more than the town's entire assessed value. So Virginia City sits on top of its own silver mining past, in a very literal sense. The infrastructure that created the city is still there, underground, directly beneath the buildings that the city built with the profits. The drawback is altitude and isolation. At over 6,000 feet in the high Nevada desert, winters are severe and the tourist season is concentrated. The town's economy today runs almost entirely on heritage tourism, which means that the physical integrity of the buildings is simultaneously the town's greatest asset and its primary maintenance burden. Property owners in a National Historic Landmark district carry preservation requirements that ordinary property owners do not, and the nearest city, Reno, is about 30 miles of winding mountain road away. For the 787 people who live there year-round, that distance is measured in ambulance response time, not scenic drive time. Jerome is falling. Not metaphorically. The town, built on the side of Cleopatra Hill in north-central Arizona, is physically, measurably moving downhill, and has been since the copper mining operations ended in 1953. Underground subsidence from the abandoned mine workings beneath the town has warped and tilted structures that were already built on a steep grade. Some buildings have been re-anchored multiple times since the 1940s to prevent collapse. Jerome's unofficial nickname, the Vertical Ghost Town, is not a tourism slogan invented by a marketing team. It describes a measurable, geological reality. The town was founded with the first copper claims on Cleopatra Hill in 1876 and incorporated in 1917. The United Verde Copper Company built Jerome into a functioning city of 10,000 at its peak in the 1920s, with hotels, saloons, apartments, a high school, and a mine museum that still operates today. The collapse came when United Verde shut down operations in 1953. The population, which had run around 10,000 at the height of production, dropped to 464 residents. That's a 95.4% decline. What stayed is a catalogue of documented structures on a hillside. Hotel Connor from 1898, Boyd Hotel from 1890, Garcia House from 1885, the Mine Museum and Fashion Saloon from 1917, Sullivan Apartments from 1917, Old Jerome High School from 1923. Main Street retains its early 20th century steep-grade routing and period facades. Wooden boardwalk-style sidewalks and historic stair tunnels carved into the hillside remain in active use. Jerome was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1966, 13 years after the mines closed. The visual experience of Jerome is unlike any other town on this list. Because it is built on a hillside at a grade that most city planners would never permit today, the town does not flatten out when you look at it. It layers. Buildings stack above each other. Streets cut across the slope at angles that force you to look up or down, rarely level. And the subsidence has added a layer of visible impermanence. Walls that lean, foundations that have settled unevenly, structures that sit at angles not intended by their builders. The town is tilted, slowly, by the ground it was built on. The drawback here is not abstract. The mine subsidence is an ongoing physical hazard, not a historical footnote. The ground beneath Jerome is actively settling, and property owners deal with structural consequences that are outside the normal range of home maintenance. Add to that the elevation. Jerome sits above 5,000 feet, and the fact that the nearest major hospital is in Prescott, roughly 30 miles away by Mountain Road. The 464 residents who live there are not unaware of any of this. They chose it. But the choice is not casual, and the tilting buildings are not charming quirks. They are evidence of what happens when a town outlives the industry that designed it. Madrid is the only town on this list that died completely and came back. Not partially, not with a skeleton crew of holdouts, completely vacant. The coal operations that built Madrid shut down in the mid-1950s, and by the time they were fully gone, so was everyone else. The company houses stood empty along the original street alignment. The miners' amusement hall sat unused. The old Catholic church, the company buildings, the mine infrastructure, all of it still there, but with no one inside any of it. For roughly 2 decades, Madrid was a ghost town in the literal sense, every building occupied by no one. The town had been founded in the 1890s as a coal mining camp connected to the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe railroad spur. At its peak in the early 20th century, Madrid had around 1,200 residents, enough for a functioning company town economy with its own amusement infrastructure, churches and services. When coal demand collapsed in the mid-1950s, the economic logic that had created Madrid simply stopped. No industry, no reason to stay. Peak to zero in a matter of years. What happened next is the part that breaks the normal ghost town pattern. Starting in the 1970s, artists began finding the empty company houses, negotiating access and moving in. Not into new construction, but into the original wooden company houses from the 1920s and 1930s. Building by building, house by house, with no coordinated plan and no developer, Madrid was reoccupied. The current population is 247. The main street alignment is unchanged from the mining era. The miners' amusement hall from the early 20th century is still there. The coal mining museum operates in a repurposed company building. New Mexico tourism materials describe Madrid as a ghost town reborn that feels like it skipped the late 20th century, which is accurate because it effectively did. Madrid is technically a census-designated place rather than an incorporated municipality. It has never had formal incorporation, operating instead within Santa Fe County. The absence of incorporation means no local zoning authority and no formal historic district designation of the type that governs Eureka Springs or Virginia City. What has preserved Madrid's character is not regulatory, it is economic and cultural. The artists and craftspeople who moved in had no budget to build new and no interest in erasing what was already there. The town's physical form survived by accident of poverty and repopulation by people who preferred the existing structures to anything they could afford to replace them with. The drawback is the same factor that made the revival possible: the absence of formal infrastructure. Madrid has no incorporated municipal government, which means no local tax base for roads, no public utilities in the conventional sense, and no formal mechanism for community-wide decisions. The main road through town, State Road 14, part of the Turquoise Trail Scenic Byway, brings tourist traffic that sustains the galleries and shops along the main strip. But that same tourism economy is seasonal, and the 247 residents live in a community that functions more like a loose collective than a town in the administrative sense. It came back without being rebuilt. It also governs itself without the structures that most Americans take for granted. The $1 Million Courthouse is still the courthouse. That is not a museum installation. That is not a heritage interpretation exhibit. The Lincoln County Courthouse in Pioche, Nevada, built in 1871, is still the active county courthouse for Lincoln County, still in official use, still serving its original governmental function, still processing Lincoln County's legal business in a building that became a regional political scandal before it was even finished. The scandal is part of the building's documented history. Cost overruns during construction in 1871 buried Lincoln County in debt that took decades to pay off. The final payment came decades after the building opened, by which point the county had paid far more than the original construction cost in interest alone. The nickname $1 Million Courthouse entered the historical record as a shorthand for governmental excess in a mining town that could barely afford the excess. The building was completed anyway, and it has been in continuous use ever since. Pioche was founded as a silver mining camp between 1864 and 1866 in southeastern Nevada, and at its peak in the 1870s and 1880s, it held around 5,000 residents. The silver mining collapse of the late 1880s hit Pioche hard and fast. The current population is 933, an 81% decline from the peak. What remains along Main Street are saloon and store facades dating to the 1870s to 1890s. The Masonic Lodge has been occupied since 1872, making it one of the longest continuously operating Masonic lodges in Nevada. Many side streets in Pioche are still dirt or gravel only, not as an aesthetic choice, but because they have never been paved. Remnants of outdoor mining tram tower infrastructure still stand on the hills surrounding the town, visible from Main Street. Pioche appears in the Historic American Buildings Survey, which documents structures of architectural and historical significance. Its isolation in southeastern Nevada is extreme even by Great Basin standards. The nearest town of 5,000 is approximately 100 miles away. one of the most isolated incorporated towns in the American West. That distance is not abstract. It means that a medical emergency in Pioche involves a response time that most urban and suburban Americans would find alarming. It means that supply chains for everything from groceries to building materials operate on a schedule, not on demand. And it means that the 933 people who live in Pioche have made a specific choice about what proximity to services is worth relative to what proximity to a preserved 19th century silver mining town provides. The honest drawback of Pioche is compounded isolation. Geographic remoteness plus economic fragility plus a built environment that is aging without the tax base to maintain it at the pace it requires. The courthouse still functions, the Masonic Lodge still meets, the facades are still standing, but maintenance on structures from the 1870s and 1880s is not inexpensive, and a county seat of 933 people in one of the least populated counties in the least populated large state in the country is not generating the revenue to keep ahead of it indefinitely. Pioche is one of the most intact Silver-era towns left in the American West. It is also one of the most structurally vulnerable, in a slow-moving way that doesn't make headlines. 5 people live in Centralia, Pennsylvania. 5. The zip code was revoked in 2002. The state took the properties by eminent domain in 1992. A federal evacuation order was issued in 1984, and the ground has been on fire since 1962. Those 5 people who remain, who refused the buyouts, refused the court orders, and refused to leave, are living on top of an active underground coal seam fire that is expected to continue burning for another 250 years. I know that sounds like something you'd see in a disaster film. It is real, it is documented, and it is happening right now. Centralia was founded in 1841 as an anthracite coal town in Columbia County, Pennsylvania, and incorporated in 1866. It followed the arc of most coal towns in the anthracite region: rapid growth tied to coal extraction, a peak population of around 2,700 in 1890, and then a long, slow contraction as the industry mechanized, consolidated, and declined. By 1962, Centralia was a small town in decline, not unusual for the region, not terminal on its own. Then a trash fire in an abandoned strip mine at the edge of town spread into the coal seam beneath it. The fire spread through the underground coal network beneath the town. It generated carbon monoxide seeps at ground level. It caused subsidence, the ground collapsing as the coal beneath burned away. Steam vents began opening in backyards and along streets. In 1981, a 12-year-old fell into a subsidence hole in his backyard that measured 150 feet deep and was venting carbon monoxide at lethal levels. The federal government began buying out residents. By the mid-1980s, most of the population had accepted the buyouts and left. By 1992, the state had acquired essentially all remaining properties through eminent domain. Most of the buildings were bulldozed. What remains is the formal street grid, still paved, still geometrically intact, with empty lots where houses once stood, and street signs identifying roads that lead nowhere in particular. The original route of Pennsylvania Route 61 through town was buckled by subsidence from the underground fire and closed permanently. The buckled stretch became known as the Graffiti Highway and was covered with painted messages from visitors until it was buried under fill material in 2020. The few remaining houses occupy what residents call the reserved corridor, the small area where the 5 remaining residents retained their properties through legal challenge. The 5 people who still live in Centralia are not uninformed. They know the ground beneath them is burning. They know the carbon monoxide readings that have been taken at various points across the site. They know the zip code is gone, that the post office closed, that the town's incorporation has been legally challenged and is in a state of ambiguous ongoing status. They stayed anyway. Some are elderly. Some have lived there their entire lives. Their refusal is not irrational from their own perspective. These are people whose identity and history are embedded in a specific place, and the fact that the place is on fire beneath them has not changed their calculus about leaving it. The fire beneath Centralia is not theoretical, and it is not slowing down. Geological surveys have documented the active burn zone expanding. The heat from the underground combustion is measurable at the surface in certain areas. Carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide seep from vents that open and close unpredictably. The estimated remaining fuel, the coal seam that extends beneath the site, is sufficient to sustain the fire for another 2.5 centuries. The town of Centralia, Pennsylvania, will be on fire until approximately the year 2270. The street grid will still be there, paved and labelled, running through lots where nothing stands. 5 people chose to remain in it in 2026, and the ground beneath them is still burning. The drawback of Centralia does not require elaboration in the usual sense. There is no hospital, there is no grocery store, there is no postal service. There is no municipal function in any conventional sense. The air quality in certain zones of the former town is actively monitored for toxic gases. The subsidence risk is ongoing and unpredictable. What Centralia represents in the context of this video is the terminal end of a spectrum that begins with Eureka Springs, a preserved town under historic review, and ends here, with 5 people on ground that has been combusting since before most of their grandchildren were born. Every town on this list exists somewhere between living community and physical ruin. Centralia exists at the point where those two categories stop being distinct from each other. 7 towns, the same country, the same general arc, a boom, a collapse, and whatever comes after, but not the same outcome, not even close. The question isn't whether these towns are worth saving. The question is what it means that they were never fully lost, just left behind at a specific moment, still running on the infrastructure of a world that no longer exists around them. Which one of these 7 would you actually spend a year in, not visit, not photograph, but actually live in? Write it in the comments and tell me why. If this kind of documentary gives you something that the standard travel format doesn't, subscribe. There are more forgotten places that the map still shows, but the guidebooks stopped covering.